I think part of being a good sports podcaster is admitting when you are wrong. And boy, have I been wrong about Keegan Akin. And I'll tell you why coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, February 6th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are winding down our Orioles 2024 player season review series. We have only 5 players left to get to after today. And the sixth to last guy we'll go over is Keegan Akin. We're going to look at what was quietly a dominant 2024 season for him out of the Orioles bullpen. We'll talk about what went right with all his stuff playing up and some of the bad luck he had in 2023. Flipping to the other side this year. We'll talk about what went wrong when he still did have some struggles and why his role did not increase despite his skills doing so. And finally, we'll chat about his biggest storyline heading into the 2025 season. We know he's pretty much got a spot locked up in the Oriole bullpen, but what kind of spot do they really use him in? That will be the question we get to and more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So let's dive into the Keegan Akin season. Now, there was not a great chance going into 2024, even with the struggles and the injuries that Akin had during the 2023 season when he didn't even reach 25 innings, had the back injury that kept him out for most of the year. He was a guy with minor league options who was a former highly ranked prospect with the Orioles. Didn't feel like, unless things went horribly wrong, he would get DFA'd by Baltimore. There was a chance he spent a good chunk of the season in AAA Norfolk, so still would be talking about him probably at this point in February of 2025. But I did not think that Akin would get to the point where he is now. As we review his 2024 season, where he pitched in 66 games out of the Oriole bullpen, and in 78 and 2/3 innings, posted a 3.32 ERA with a 2.99 FIP, good for 1.4 wins over at Fangraphs. He was able to put together a 31% strikeout rate to just a 6.1% walk rate, with opponents hitting just 188 against Akin during the season. Those are some fantastic numbers for a big league reliever that logged almost 80 innings, a very high usage big league reliever like Akin was. And I'll admit it, I was been one of Keegan Akin's biggest haters for a long chunk of his MLB career since the Orioles first called him up to make a few starts in the shortened 2020 season. He's had his role change multiple times, been up and down between the bigs and AAA multiple times since that 2020 season. And we get to 2025, and I think finally he has established himself. And I didn't think he was ever going to be able to do this, but he made the adjustments he needed to, and he is now a good reliever. Now, there are still questions that we'll get to, but let's start with what went right for Keegan Akin in 2024. And really the first thing is, like, this was the best season altogether of Keegan Akin's career. It wasn't 81 and 2/3 innings that he pitched out of the bullpen in 2022, but still a really high workload. Wasn't his lowest ERA because it was a bit lower in 2022 as well, but the highest strikeout rate, his lowest walk rate, his highest WAR, and the underlying numbers: 6th in baseball in xWOBA, 6th in expected ERA, 11th in expected batting average allowed. He was, when he was out there, one of the best pitchers, at least relievers, in the major leagues, and was certainly one of the best pitchers the Orioles employed in 2024. And one of the big things that was able to go right for Akin was the underlying numbers he had in the disappointing 2023 season finally showed up as surface numbers, because Akin pitched only 23 and 2/3 innings in 2023. He was an arm the Orioles kind of missed. He had some struggles with ineffectiveness. Then he had a back issue that took him out for most of the second half of the season. Really wasn't a factor when the Orioles went on to win 101 games and win the division that year. And he posted a 6.85 ERA when he was on the field that season. But it came with a 2.96 FIP. FIP is fielding independent pitching. FIP is a stat that is a better predictor of what your ERA really should be. It takes out how bad your defense might be. It involves a lot more with strikeouts, walks, and home runs, things that pitchers can control a whole lot more. It takes into account the ballpark a little bit as well. And when you see a discrepancy like that of almost 4 runs between an ERA and a FIP, that tells you that a pitcher got insanely unlucky in that season. Now, it is a small sample size, less than 25 innings, so that a small sample size also can play a factor in a big difference between ERA and FIP. But there's no denying that Akin, under the surface, was loads better than his ERA of almost 7 showed. He was the only pitcher in baseball who threw at least 20 big league innings in 2023 to have an ERA over 6 and yet a FIP under 3. Basically had the biggest difference between those two stats of anyone. And it was from some terrible batted ball luck. His BABIP against, which is batting average on balls in play, was 434 in that shortened sample size in 2023. League average sits around like 270, and he was at 434. That is a ridiculous amount of bad luck. The stuff was still strong, and he flipped it to, hey, a 299 FIP this year, which was 23rd in Major League Baseball. Now, how did those changes come about? Where the underlying metrics were there, but they finally showed themselves on the field in 2024? Well, a lot of it was strikeouts and walks. I mentioned a 31% strikeout rate. That is elite. League average is around 22%. And a 6.1% walk rate. That's elite. League average is around 8%. He was very, very good in both those categories. Leaves you with a 24.9% strikeout minus walk ratio in the major leagues. You want a big gap there, right? You want your strikeout percentage to be way higher than your walk rate. The 24.9% gap, 11th largest in baseball among pitchers who threw at least 70 innings in 2024. That is huge. And it was 6th if you just count relievers who threw that many innings. Here are some guys who had unbelievable 2024 seasons. Were considered probably 4 of the top 10 relievers in all of Major League Baseball last year. And all of them had big moments in the postseason as well. Emmanuel Clase, Luke Weaver, Tyler Holton, Hunter Gaddis, all had smaller strikeout minus walk ratios than Keegan Akin did in 2024. And just the strikeout rate itself, take out what he did with the walks, just a strikeout rate itself of 31% was still 8th in baseball among guys who threw at least 70 innings. Like, even if he had walked a bunch of batters, he still had an elite strikeout rate. You add it with a minuscule walk rate and just an incredible season. His whiff rate was elite. His walk rate was obviously very small as well. And the funny thing was, Akin in his 2022 season that was really good as well. One of the reasons why he was good that year is that he was getting guys to swing and miss, or at least just swing in general, at a lot of pitches outside the strike zone. In 2022, he had a chase rate of over 32%, 32.4% that year. That was in the 82nd percentile in Major League Baseball, meaning he was getting guys to swing at bad pitches out of the zone, getting them to swing and miss or hit pop-ups or weak grounders, and was getting a lot of outs doing that. That was not his way of success this year. His chase rate dropped all the way down more than 8 percentage points. It was down at 25.7% in 2024. That was just the 16th percentile in the major. So most pitchers were getting swings on pitches outside the zone way more often than Akin was. So you're thinking, how does he have a 31% strikeout rate with these good of numbers if when he throws it out of the zone, nobody's really swinging at it? Well, he just didn't really throw the ball out of the strike zone. And what this tells you, when you have a chase rate that low and numbers this good, that your stuff is so good that it is playing up inside the strike zone. You are getting a bunch of swings and misses inside the strike zone. There's a lot of pitchers in baseball that can generate a swing and miss. There's nothing more valuable to a pitcher than a swing and a miss, avoiding contact altogether. Because you know nothing bad is going to happen, unless you're walking everybody, if you avoid contact. But for Akin, he's avoiding that contact in the zone. A lot of pitchers are able to do it because their stuff is so nasty. They throw it outside the zone. It's got great break. Guys chase. Akin throws in the zone. So for some of those guys that are nasty outside the zone, if you just wait them out, you can draw a lot of walks. That's not the case with Keegan Akin because he is pounding the strike zone when he is out there, and they still can't make contact. A 22.9% in-zone whiff rate, which means about 23% of the time when a hitter swung at a pitch in the zone, he swung and missed. That is a very, very high rate. Actually, the 18th highest rate among qualified relievers. That is really good for getting swings and misses inside the strike zone. And that tells you a guy who has really good stuff, if he can throw it for strikes and isn't getting hit hard, even though batters know he's not going to walk me. I'm going to swing. I'm going to get pitches in the zone, and they still can't square them up. And that tells you he had nasty stuff. And then you dig into his 3-pitch mix, 4-seam fastball, slider, and changeup, and all 3 pitches were nasty for Keegan Akin this year. He threw his 4-seamer about 59% of the time, super heavy usage, averages about 94 miles an hour, and opponents hit just 186, or excuse me, that was right-handers hitting just 186 against it. Opponents hit just 215. Then he had his slider, threw it about a third of the time. It's about 85, 86 miles an hour with tight break. It's not a huge sweeping slider, but he got a 35.7% swing and miss rate on that slider, highest on any pitch of his career. And then you have the changeup, which earlier in his career, like when he first came up in 2020, was his bread and butter, especially back when he was a starter. As a reliever, he's gone away from that changeup some. He throws it exclusively to right-handers, threw it about 11% of the time this year. And it's an 86-mile-per-hour changeup that opponents hit 190 against with a good swing and miss rate. All 3 of his offerings this year had an expected batting average of under 190 and an expected slugging of under 350. Those are fantastic numbers. Even the 4-seam fastball, like a 28.1% swing and miss rate against your fastball, that is very high for a 4-seamer, especially a pitch that you are throwing 56% of the time. That is fairly impressive for what Keegan Akin was able to do. And if you're wondering, how is that fastball so good? Well, I'll show you a chart here. This is from StatCast and Baseball Savant. This is the pitch movement profile for Akin's 3 offerings: the slider, the changeup, and the 4-seam fastball. And if you look right here at the red dots in the kind of upper left part of this graph, you can see the vertical break. And as you can see on the graph, the higher those dots are up, the more rise that pitch is getting. And this is something we talk about with 4-seam fastballs. The best 4-seam fastballs, yes, they have good velocity, but you're looking at a fastball that Akin throws 94. That's certainly good velocity for a left-hander, but it's not considered elite fastball velocity in Major League Baseball in 2024. So how is it so good at 94 miles an hour? Well, he has some deception in his delivery, hides the ball pretty well, but he also has elite induced vertical break. What that means is the ball doesn't drop as much as it normally would. It gives off the appearance that it's rising just because of gravity and physics. The ball doesn't actually rise as it goes towards the strike zone. It has to go down, but it drops way less than other pitches. So a hitter is standing in there expecting a fastball to come on a bit of a downward angle towards your bat. But when you have that good induced vertical break, which Keegan Akin has over 18 inches of, and 18 is the benchmark of like being elite in that category, and Akin has surpassed it, it just dropped less. So you swing and miss underneath it. You hit underneath the ball to hit pop-ups and lazy fly balls a lot that turn into outs. And that is what Akin has been able to do. And it's something he's done well throughout his career. But if you look at the chart right here, the 18.3 inches of induced vertical break for Keegan Akin, the kind of striped line area, those are the average 4-seam fastballs in Major League Baseball for induced vertical break. You can see all of the fastballs that Akin threw this year are in that cluster of red dots. Pretty much all of them fall above the average circle. So it's not like, oh, he's mostly average, but some of his fastballs are really good. No, pretty much every fastball he throws is well above that league average of that quote unquote rising effect that it has. And that is what makes him so good. Every single fastball, you can't, the old saying of getting on top of it, you can't get on top of it because it just moves unlike other 4-seam fastballs. I mean, the league leaders are at about 20 inches and Akin's at 18. He's got the same induced vertical break as guys like Dylan Cease, Bryce Miller, Shota Imanaga, Pete Fairbanks. These are guys with elite 4-seam fastballs, and Akin is right there. All those guys with 18.3 inches of induced vertical break, just like Keegan Akin. It is an impressive group. And the other thing that it does, as I mentioned, it gets a lot of swings and misses because you just swing under the ball. But sometimes good hitters can see it a little bit, and they can at least make contact. But when you're making a lot of contact under the ball, what are you doing? Lots of lazy pop-ups, lots of lazy fly balls to the outfield. And we've talked about this a lot on this podcast this offseason as we've broken down Anthony Santander before he signed with the Blue Jays. We talked about how he doesn't strike out a lot, but he hits so many infield pop-ups. And infield pop-ups, 999 times out of 1,000, they're just as bad for a hitter or just as good for a pitcher as a strikeout. And quite honestly, you could say an infield pop-up at times is actually better for a pitcher than a strikeout, because at least for a strikeout, you have to use at least 3 pitches. For a pop-up, you could get one on the first pitch and keep your pitch count down even lower and get the same result. Because, again, almost every single time, an infield pop-up is going to be caught by an infielder. There's going to be no chance for any runners to advance bases. It's just like a strikeout, getting nothing done positively for the hitter. And Keegan Akin, his infield pop-up rate in 2024 of 16.3%, that was 6th highest in baseball among pitchers who threw at least 7 innings. That's about 16% of his fly balls were pop-ups. So if you break it down to percentage of just batters faced that were pop-ups, it's about 5%. So you take a 31% strikeout rate, you add the 5% infield pop-up rate, you got 36% of the batters Keegan Akin is facing. They are doing absolutely nothing. No productive outs, nothing, just sending them right back to the bench without helping their team at all. That is over a third of the batters he is facing. That's what turns you into an elite reliever, especially a guy who may come in with runners on base. You're looking for strikeouts. You're looking for infield pop-ups in those spots. And Akin was just so good at that in 2024. And I like the slider. It's kind of a tight break. It's actually kind of funny. His slider has less movement on it in 2024 than it did the previous 2 years. And I think it helped him because hitters almost expect it to move more. And when it doesn't, they swing and miss, or they make weak contact because it doesn't end up on the part of the barrel they thought that it would. But really the other pitch that helped him out was the changeup. Like, he trusted his changeup. That was his money pitch coming up through the minor leagues when he was the International League Pitcher of the Year in 2019 in AAA Norfolk. He loved that changeup, but it kind of started to evade him in his first couple of years in the big leagues as a starter. He moved to the bullpen, started throwing it less. But even though he only threw his changeup 11% of the time this year, it was, interestingly, kind of a good pitch for the first time in his career. And he started to throw it a little bit more as the season went on. 9% usage in April, 7% in May, 9% in June, and then 15% in July, 14% in August, and 11% in September. Akin frankly had a better second half than he did first half. And some of it was because more changeup usage. I mean, opponents hit just 190 against it, 25% swing and miss rate. Expected batting average of 171, expected slugging of 228. Just nobody could square up that pitch at all. And that changeup, which he throws basically exclusively to righties, was good for the first time in his career. And that allowed him to also not have these big platoon splits. You might sometimes have these lefty relievers who come in and they're awesome against left-handed batters. Like, lefties cannot touch them. But you throw some right-handed batters in there and they start to struggle. That really wasn't the case for Akin this year. And a lot of that had to do with a great riding fastball and that really good changeup. He was better against lefties, which most left-handers are. Left-handed hitters had a 560 OPS against Akin, but right-handed hitters only had a 618 OPS against Akin this year. They were not much better than lefties were. And that is the other thing. If you're going to throw bulk innings, pushing 80 innings as a reliever, you can't have big platoon splits. And Akin did not have them. That made him so good. And really the last thing, I know we've gone long on what went well, but a lot went well for Keegan Akin in 2024. Really the last thing of what went well for Akin last year was he was just kind of fun to watch. And that was the other thing with Akin. Even when he was going through times when he was good as a starter or a reliever, wasn't the most intriguing pitcher to watch. I think he is a really good watch when he is on the mound. StatCast shows us that he has the fastest tempo among all Orioles pitchers with runners on base. What that means is nobody worked faster. Nobody had a smaller amount of time in between pitches when there were runners on than Keegan Akin. He got up there and he was ready to throw the ball over the plate. And that was nice. And hey, 46.1% in zone rate for Akin. About 46% of his pitches were in the strike zone. That led the Orioles. That was 23rd among all qualified relievers in baseball this year. So nobody was pounding the zone more than Keegan Akin this year. And also 63.6% first pitch strike rate. So almost 2/3 of his batters, he threw a first pitch strike. That was also first among all Orioles. And you add that to, hey, he's not a guy that lets guys run all over him. According to StatCast, only Grayson Rodriguez was better among Orioles pitchers at holding runners this year. And Akin, nobody even attempted to steal a base when Akin was on the mound in 2024. He's got a good pickoff move. He's quick to the plate. He changes timings. He's just a fun guy to watch work because it's refreshing. He works quickly. He throws strikes, and his stuff is good enough in the zone that he gets swings and misses. He puts hitters away. He doesn't walk guys. I've been a big hater of Keegan Akin for years. I took some of that off when he had a really good 2022, brought it back when he had a rough injury-filled 23, but he stayed healthy in 2024. The stuff ticked up, and he looks like he could be a huge piece for this bullpen. I mean, if you just take the name Keegan Akin out and you show, if you're watching here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, you'll see this. If you just show this Baseball Savant page, you're looking at a guy who any team would love to have in its bullpen. If I just showed you this page blindly as an Orioles fan and said, hey, the O's just acquired this guy to be in their bullpen, you'd be ecstatic for the stuff that shows up on this page. And then if I told you, actually, that's Keegan Akin, well, you've seen him really struggle over the years at times, and you pull back, and that was kind of my reaction. But if you just blindly look at these numbers he put up this year, this is a great, great reliever. So the question is, okay, why is he not seen as one of the best relievers in baseball at this point? Like, what's the flip side of this? And the flip side is, despite all these good numbers, you never really saw Akin in the 8th and 9th inning in the key spots down the stretch. And I'll tell you why that was the case coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that can really bring fans together. You can get so much excitement at NFL playoff games, not just that, Major League Baseball playoff games. When I went to game 1 of the Wild Card Series last year, it's always fun. And I'm looking forward to making new memories this season as well. And over at Game Time, that's where you can get those tickets. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, earlier in the playoffs, before, unfortunately, their season ended, I was using Game Time Picks to look at Ravens playoff tickets for that game against the Steelers, and I found great value for all kind of seats at M&T Bank Stadium. Plus, on-time ticket delivery, lowest price guarantee. It gives you peace of mind on a ticketing website. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we have talked about everything that made Keegan Akin just so good in the 2024 season. So what went wrong for him, right? It wasn't a perfect season. What went wrong? Well, the big thing is, like, these are the stats of an elite reliever. But Keegan Akin, his usage patterns were not that of an elite reliever. And I know this is where many of you, the Brandon Hyde haters of the world, are going to jump out and say it's because Brandon Hyde hates Keegan Akin and doesn't want to use him and he can't manage a bullpen and blah, blah, blah. Could there be a little bit of that he is a little afraid to put Akin in the bigger spots? Maybe. But I wanted to break down really a look at Akin's usage because it does, after reading out all of the great stats and the amazing things Akin did last year, this part will put a little bit of that into perspective. Among Orioles relievers who threw at least 20 innings last year, there were 11 different relievers who threw 20 innings for the O's last year. These are the guys that were used more than sparingly throughout the length of a 162-game season. Only 4 of them had a lower average leverage index than entering the game than Keegan Akin. The average leverage index over at Fangraphs basically tries to show, okay, how important of a moment in the game is this? Is it high leverage, medium leverage, low leverage? 1 is about average leverage, so anything below 1 is going to be very low leverage. Anything above 1 is going to get to higher leverage. Keegan Akin was at 1.05. That was his average leverage index when entering the game. So basically just slightly above average index when he was entering games. And for guys who threw at least 70 innings last year, there were 31 of them in the big leagues. Akin's leverage index was the 8th lowest of that group. So for a guy throwing that much, it's rare for him to be in so many low leverage spots. But here are the 4 guys who had a lower leverage index when they entered the game than Keegan Akin. Cole Irvin, who once he got moved to the bullpen before he was DFA'd, was just the Orioles mop-up guy. Dylan Tate, who went up and down a couple of times coming back from the elbow injury and never really found his footing. Brian Baker, who spent most of the season in AAA, and when he was up here was certainly not the 2022 version of himself. And Birch Smith, who was acquired midseason and was off the Orioles roster in September. Those were the four guys who basically you could say were trusted less in terms of high leverage spots than Keegan Akin this year. Every other Orioles reliever who threw at least 20 innings had a higher leverage index. And Fangraphs, they grouped that leverage into three categories I mentioned: low leverage, medium leverage, and high leverage. It's kind of intricate how they parse it out, but you can imagine as a baseball fan, what's a high leverage spot, what's a medium leverage spot, what's a low leverage spot. Well, for Keegan Akin, he threw 78 and 2/3 innings last year. 60 of those innings came in low leverage. That is a huge percentile, and he was great in low leverage. 272 FIP, just a 556 OPS allowed. He was fantastic. Then 14 of his innings came in medium leverage. Okay, these are probably more like fifth or sixth inning spots when the game is closer, maybe seventh or eighth inning, getting a little later. You have a little bit larger lead, but he's in there to hold that lead. 636 OPS allowed, 352 FIP. Those are still good numbers in low leverage. Keegan Akin, of his almost 79 innings, threw only 4 2/3 innings in high leverage spots last year. Those are close game, one-run game, tie game, eighth and ninth inning, and extras. Akin was barely in those spots, despite the fact that I mentioned all those stats that showed him as like a top 15 reliever in baseball, top 20 reliever in baseball at times last year. And when he was in that high leverage, he was not good. 488 FIP and an 879 OPS against him. So you look at it and you're like, is it a chicken or the egg situation? On one hand, is it Keegan Akin was only good because he was in so many low leverage situations? Or on the flip side, is it Keegan Akin was only in low leverage situations in a spot to be that good because what he had shown in the past and this year was just that he didn't warranted being trusted in the high leverage spots? And at this point, I'm not in the mind of Brandon Hyde and others. I don't really know the answer there. What I do know is that he didn't even get a bigger shot when Danny Coulombe went down. June 8th was the final day of Danny Coulombe being healthy this year. Remember, he missed 3+ months, had the surgery on his elbow. Danny Coulombe, for the year and change before that, was the Orioles' go-to left-hander in their bullpen. Coulombe goes down. The Orioles still had Cionel Perez, but you would think Keegan Akin would get a bump in his role. It actually went the other way. His leverage index for Keegan Akin through June 8th was 1.43 at Fangraphs when he entered the game. That's well above average. From June 9th through the end of the season, his leverage index was 0.79. It dropped way down even with Coulombe out. It was Cionel Perez. It was Jacob Webb. It was eventually Gregory Soto after the deadline who took those key spots against, patches of left-handed hitters in opposing lineups. And it wasn't Keegan Akin who got into those spots. So we kind of don't know how all these good numbers will translate into big moments because, again, he barely got the chances in the high leverage spots. We'll talk about why that was. Now, the other couple of things that didn't go well, he did have a horrendous month of May. He walked 7 and struck out 8 and had a 6+ ERA and 11 2/3 innings in May. He was just walking a bunch of guys. You take out May, he had a 2.82 ERA and 67 innings the rest of the year. And he did get sent down once. Now, he was staying healthy. And after the big back injury in 2023, he avoided the IL in 2024. But after the trade deadline, the Orioles picked up Zach Eflin, Seranthony Dominguez, Gregory Soto, Trevor Rogers. They had to make some tough roster decisions. Akin had options. And on August 1st, he went down to AAA Norfolk. Then 6 days later, the Orioles placed both Grayson Rodriguez and Jacob Webb on the injury list. And Akin came right back up to the big league roster and remained on it for the rest of the season and did pitch in the postseason in Game 2 of the Wild Card Series against the Royals as well. But you're just like, he was so good, but none in high leverage. So you got to put an asterisk next to it because it's like he's not pitching, despite he's pitching so well, he's not pitching in the biggest moments. He's not facing the batters in the times that Yennier Cano is, that Danny Coulombe is, that even guys like Jacob Webb and Seranthony Dominguez and Gregory Soto were at the end of that season, not the guys that Felix Bautista has in the past and will moving forward. So the question is now, like, he showed enough, I think, to get a spot in this Oriole bullpen in 2025. But what does the role look like? We'll try to answer that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions of winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 100 times your cash. Prize Picks even has a free pick for the big game, where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard for you to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. So you can look at the board and say, are you selecting more for Travis Kelce on receiving yards? Maybe you're selecting less on something like Jalen Hurts passing yards, whatever it may be. A couple of correct picks, and you can win. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is code LOCKEDONMLB for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. And that is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So we've talked about what went well for Keegan Akin's fantastic 2024 season. We talked about what went wrong with him just, despite being so good, not getting the chances to do so in high leverage spots. So now we try to figure out, like, what is the biggest storyline for Keegan Akin heading into the 2025 season? And I think it's pretty obvious from what we've talked about. Will Keegan Akin get the chance to pitch in bigger spots? And if he does, will he be as good and as effective as he was in all those lower leverage roles we saw him in 2024? I mean, when I picture Keegan Akin in a high leverage spot last year, and he had some big spots he was in, I picture 2 of them. I picture 9th inning at Nationals Park in that wild extra inning game in May when he blew the save, gave up a hit to C.J. Abrams. And then I think about in Boston in September. Now, Jackson Holliday made an error and put him in a bad spot here, but he's pitching in the bottom of the 10th, the Orioles with a 1-run lead. He allows a walk-off 3-run homer to current Orioles legend Tyler O'Neill in that big spot as well. And those are the ones I remember him in where he just didn't come through in the big moments in high leverage. But you would think Akin would get more of those chances this year. Now, Danny Coulombe was injured last year and he didn't get the chances. Now, at least to this point, Coulombe is gone, although Danny Coulombe still, at least at the time of recording here on Monday, is still a free agent. I guess still an outside possibility. The Orioles could find a deal to bring him back. But at this point, Coulombe is no longer the number 1 lefty in your bullpen. And there are still questions about Cionel Perez and Gregory Soto, the other 2 lefties in there. Like, is Soto the pitcher down the stretch he was for the O's, or was he the guy that was kind of struggling in Philly and the reason why the Phillies were willing to trade him at the deadline last year? Cionel Perez, he doesn't give up homers, but he's given up too much contact and he's way too wild. Are those walks going to be an issue? Like, those are questions about those guys that we don't have about Akin stats-wise because he was so good when he was out there. The question is, can he repeat it when the game is on the line? And he wasn't pitching that much when the game was on the line last year. Will the Orioles give him these big chances? Could he have a chance to become the number 1 high-leverage lefty, which that job is open now with Danny Coulombe gone? Or is it worth it to just not mess with what was working? You still need these good middle relief, mop-up, multi-inning guys. And the Orioles had, you could argue, maybe the best one in baseball with what Keegan Akin did for them in that role last year. Like, 25 of his 66 appearances last season were more than 1 inning, and 14 of those 66 were at least 2 innings of work. And in those 14 outings, when Akin went 2 innings or more, he posted a 1.55 ERA in those 14 outings. That is very, very impressive what he did when he was pitching 2 or more innings. That is a weapon to have in your bullpen, a guy who can go out there for 2+ innings and keep you in a game, keep you in the lead, bridge it from an injured starter or a rough start from somebody that doesn't finish 5 innings. It is huge to have Akin out there. And it's even better when you realize that because the Orioles were smart with Keegan Akin's options last year, he still has 1 minor league option year remaining for 2025. So if there is a stretch of the season where Akin is still in this multi-inning, bridge swingman role in the Oriole bullpen, and he pitches 2 innings twice in 3 days because the O's need him to, they have the ability to have the roster flexibility to option him to AAA, call up a fresh reliever, wait a couple of weeks, and then get Akin back to keep their bullpen in a good spot as they get into the dog days of summer at some point in 2025. And the Orioles, when you look around their bullpen, the only other guys in their projected bullpen who have options are Yennier Cano and Felix Bautista. Those are your 8th and 9th inning guys. You really don't want to put yourself in a spot where you have to send them to AAA. So Akin is going to be huge for roster flexibility on this team as well. And I may not want to send him down, but it might come to the point where you have to. And if there's going to be a guy you feel like you have to send down to stay flexible, you want it to be a guy who's a multi-inning guy, because it's more likely that he exhausts himself and isn't available for a couple of days, and it takes off the sting of having to send him down. And I mentioned those 14 outings when he went 2 or more innings. Only once in those 14 outings did he allow multiple runs. Like, he's really, really good when he goes out there in those spots. So, he's got one option remaining. He's got 2 years remaining before he's a free agent. He'll be a free agent after 2026. Like, do the Orioles test it as a high leverage guy? I'm sure he'll get overall more high leverage chances this year than he did last year, just because the state of the bullpen and how good he was. But it's a different question of, will they actually move him into a high leverage role? I honestly think no. I think you need the role that he gave the Orioles last year. He pitched them almost 80 innings to a 3 ERA and was fantastic. The Orioles added to the bullpen. They have, I think, on paper, the best bullpen they've had in a while, with Dominguez and Soto coming back. You got Bautista coming back. You still got Cano. You add Andrew Kittredge. I really, really like this Oriole bullpen on paper heading into this season. I don't think they'll need Keegan Akin in a high leverage role. So if you can have a pitcher that dominant in that swingman role in the 5th and 6th innings, that makes your bullpen so much deeper and so much better in that spot. So I would say keep him in that role. Obviously, there are injuries that push him to the high leverage role. That's fine. But I say keep him in this swingman role where he has pitched so well. And then beyond that, if the Orioles need starting pitching in 2026, I wouldn't hate for him to get another chance at that role, just because he's doing so well in multi-innings. We've seen other relievers do it in the past couple of years, transition back to a starter. Akin maybe next offseason could be the next guy to do that. But let me know in the comments here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. Would you keep Akin in this kind of lower leverage swingman role, or would you push him into high leverage because he was so good last year? And while you're doing that, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And of course, subscribe wherever you listen, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you can leave a 5-star rating and a review there, that really, really helps out the show. Unless the O's give us another Friday news dump, this is most likely the final episode of the week. But if you can believe it, Orioles pitchers and catchers report next week. Yes, next week, pitchers and catchers report. We are that close. And because of that, we are back to the grind here at Locked On Orioles. Starting on Monday, we are back to 5 episodes per week. We got through the offseason at 3 episodes per week. The Orioles come back to Sarasota. We go back to 5 per week. We'll get you in-depth analysis of everything happening down in Sarasota on the lead up to opening day 2025. One more thing to mention, I've been talking about it this week. There's getting a lot of interest thinking about doing a Locked On Orioles listeners fantasy baseball league. If you are interested, shoot me an email, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Even if you have already put in the YouTube comment section that you're interested, I'm going to do most of it via email. So please send that email, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. Or if you have other thoughts about the show you want to share, mailbag questions, whatever it may be, send it to that email as well. Again, if there's no Orioles news, I'll be back on Monday. And until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.